In the cold light of dawn, she stood on the courthouse steps, a single mother clutching the last pieces of her hope. Her trembling hands held the documents that could save her home, her child, her dignity. But inside those marble walls, justice wore a blindfold that looked more like indifference. The judge barely looked at her. His gavel struck not for fairness, but for power. And as that echo faded through the courtroom, a silent sentence was passed, not on paper, but on her soul. She walked out alone, but fate had already set something in motion that no court could control. The streets didn't offer comfort, only whispers. People crossed to the other side, afraid to catch her despair. Her little boy asked why the man in the robe didn't help them. She had no answer. That night, under the hum of a flickering streetlight, she swore she would find justice, even if it lived outside the law. What she didn't know was that someone had already been watching. Men who carried no badges, no gavels, but had their own code carved in iron and loyalty. They called themselves the Hell's Angels. To most, they were outlaws. To her, they would become something far more unexpected, the hand of justice the system had denied. When word of her story reached their ears, it wasn't pity they felt. It was rage, the kind that burns for truth, not vengeance. They saw in her what the world had ignored: courage wrapped in exhaustion, defiance hidden behind tears. And that was enough to ignite their code. That night, roaring engines cut through the quiet town. Neighbors peeked through curtains as headlights painted the courthouse walls in fire and chrome. The law had turned its back on her, but these men were about to turn the tables. What began as one woman's plea for fairness was about to shake the foundation of every man who thought power meant immunity. Because sometimes, justice doesn't wear a robe. It wears leather, rides steel, and speaks through the thunder of 100 engines in the dark. And before the sun rose again, the single mother who once begged for mercy would stand before her child, not as a victim, but as the reason legends are born. The next morning, the mother's small apartment felt colder than ever. The walls, once filled with laughter and lullabies, now echoed only silence and fear. Her son, barely 6, sat at the kitchen table tracing shapes in his oatmeal, asking when they could go home again. She didn't have the heart to tell him that their home was gone, taken by the same system that promised to protect them. The court had ruled in favor of her landlord, a man with deep pockets and deeper connections. She had fought with all she had, but in the end, her voice was drowned by money and power. Outside, life went on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. People smiled. But she walked the streets invisible, clutching a bag that carried everything she owned. Every step was a reminder of what she'd lost. Not just her house, but her faith in justice. The sound of motorcycle engines in the distance caught her attention for a moment, but she kept walking, unaware that destiny was already rumbling closer. That evening, she sat in a diner, her son asleep beside her in the booth. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, refilled her coffee and whispered, "You should talk to the angels." The mother frowned, thinking it was a cruel joke. But the waitress leaned closer and said softly, "They don't help everyone, but when they do, they make things right." She pointed toward the parking lot, where 3 motorcycles stood under the neon glow, polished chrome reflecting the word freedom from a flickering sign. Curiosity battled with fear. The mother had heard stories about the Hell's Angels, about their power, their danger, their code. But something about that word, freedom, stayed with her. For the first time in days, her heart beat with something new, possibility. As she looked down at her sleeping son, she whispered to herself, "If the law won't protect us, maybe they will." When she stepped outside, the air was thick with gasoline and destiny. The bikers were there, 3 men, their faces shadowed by the night. The tallest one turned his head, meeting her eyes for a moment that felt longer than a heartbeat. Without a word, he nodded toward the bench near their bikes. It was an invitation, not of safety, but of choice. And for the first time since the gavel fell, she felt like someone was listening. The man who spoke first was known only as Ryder. His voice was low, calm, yet heavy with authority. "We heard what happened," he said, lighting a cigarette and watching the smoke curl into the night. "You went up against the wrong kind of power." She nodded, unsure whether to cry or stay silent. Another biker, younger but with eyes like sharpened glass, muttered, "Courts don't care about people like us. But we do." The words struck her deeper than he could know. She told them everything. The eviction, the threats, the judge who dismissed her tears with a smirk. As she spoke, their faces darkened, not with pity, but with controlled fury. They didn't interrupt. They didn't question her. They listened, really listened, in a way no one else had. When she finished, Ryder crushed his cigarette under his boot and said, "Then we'll make sure he remembers you." She froze, uncertain what he meant. "You don't have to," she began, but he stopped her. "You asked for justice," he said. "We're just giving it back to the ones who stole it." There was something terrifying and comforting in his tone. The voice of men who had seen too much of the world's hypocrisy and decided to fight on their own terms. Later that night, the mother returned to the small motel where she'd been staying. Her son slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering outside. From the window, she saw motorcycle headlights disappearing into the distance, like streaks of vengeance cutting through the dark. She didn't know what they would do, and maybe she didn't want to. But for the first time since losing everything, she whispered a prayer, not to the law, but to the road. The next morning, the town awoke to whispers. The landlord's office was burned, not to the ground, but enough to send a message. No one was hurt, but the fear in his eyes told everyone that the angels had been there. On the courthouse steps, a single piece of paper was found, pinned under a motorcycle emblem. It read only 3 words, "Justice rides free." And though she had not lifted a finger, the mother knew that her cry for help had been answered, not by power, but by loyalty born of the road. For the next few days, the small town felt different. The judge who had mocked her no longer walked with pride. He moved cautiously, glancing over his shoulder as if the sound of engines haunted him. Rumors spread fast, about men on bikes who appeared at midnight and left behind warnings no one dared ignore. Some called them criminals. Others whispered the truth, that they were justice in its rawest form. And in the middle of all that quiet chaos, the single mother lived between fear and gratitude, unsure whether she was safe or being protected. One evening, as she tucked her son into bed, there was a knock on the door. Her heart jumped. When she opened it, she saw Ryder standing there, helmet under his arm. His leather jacket carried the Hell's Angels emblem like a badge of silent authority. "You're safe now," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "They won't touch you again." She didn't ask what he had done or how. She just nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Ryder turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He paused, looking back at her. "Because once someone helped my mother," he said simply, "and I couldn't do anything for her. But I can for you." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, the tough outlaw looked almost human, broken, but whole enough to protect others for what had shattered him. After he left, she stood at the window, watching his motorcycle fade into the darkness. The roar of his engine felt less like thunder and more like a heartbeat, a pulse of justice echoing through the night. For the first time, she didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like part of something bigger, something fierce and real. The world had tried to silence her, but now she had a voice, and it roared on 2 wheels. The next day, when she went to the diner, people looked at her differently, not with pity, but with respect and fear. The same waitress who had introduced her to the angels smiled knowingly. "Told you they make things right," she said, pouring her coffee. The mother smiled softly. "Yes," she whispered, "but they also make you believe again." Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a fragile kind of peace. The landlord disappeared from town, the judge requested a transfer, and those who had once ignored her now crossed the street to greet her. But the change that mattered most wasn't around her, it was inside her. The woman who once trembled before power now walked with quiet strength. Every day, she worked small jobs, saved every coin, and dreamed of building a home again. Her son smiled more, laughed louder, and sometimes, when motorcycles roared in the distance, he'd run to the window and wave, certain they could see him. But the angels hadn't forgotten her. One night, a knock came again, softer this time. When she opened the door, there was no one there. Only a small envelope resting on the doormat. Inside was a set of keys and a handwritten note, for the woman who stood tall when the world tried to break her. Home is waiting. She rushed outside, but the street was empty except for the fading echo of engines. The next morning, she followed the address on the envelope. At the edge of town stood a small house, nothing grand, but strong, welcoming, painted in soft blue. On the porch lay a single rose and a leather patch with the Hells Angels insignia. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the door. Inside, everything was simple but perfect. A kitchen ready for warmth, a small bed for her boy, and sunlight pouring through the windows like forgiveness. She fell to her knees and wept, not because of what she'd been given, but because of what it meant. Somewhere out there, a group of men the world called dangerous had done more for her than the entire system built to protect her. She realized then that justice didn't always come dressed in suits and ties. Sometimes it came covered in dust, scars, and the smell of gasoline. That night, she lit a candle by the window. It was her way of saying thank you, a silent signal to the road. And as the wind carried the faint echo of engines in the distance, she smiled, knowing they'd understand. Months rolled by, and the once broken woman grew into a pillar of quiet resilience. The small blue house became a symbol in the town, not of rebellion, but of redemption. People whispered about her story in hushed tones, never sure what parts were rumor and what parts were truth. Some said the Hells Angels had taken down an entire corruption network for her. Others swore they'd seen Ryder watching over her from the highway, his engine idling like a guardian spirit. She never confirmed anything. She just smiled and kept living, as though peace itself had chosen to stay. Her son grew bolder too. He played outside, unafraid, his laughter echoing down the street. One afternoon, he came running in, holding a small patch of fabric he'd found near the fence, a faded piece of leather with the faint outline of wings. "Mom," he said with wide eyes, "it's from them." She held the patch gently, her heart swelling with gratitude and nostalgia. "Yes," she said softly, "it's from our angels." At night, she often sat on the porch, watching the stars. She thought about Ryder, about the way he'd spoken, the pain he carried beneath his silence. Sometimes she wondered if helping her had helped him too. The memory of his words replayed often. "Once, someone helped my mother." It reminded her that every act of kindness leaves a mark, even when the world isn't watching. But deep down, she knew peace was a fragile thing. Justice, especially the kind found on the edge of the law, never stayed still for long. The news began to whisper again, about raids, arrests, betrayals. The angels were being hunted, their chapters torn apart by men who didn't understand their code. She worried, not for herself, but for those who had become her silent protectors. One evening, as thunder rolled across the sky, she stood by the window and whispered into the storm, "Be safe, wherever you are." And though the rain drowned her words, she believed, with every part of her soul, that somewhere out there, Ryder heard her. The storm didn't pass easily. Days later, headlines flooded the town. Outlaw biker leader captured in midnight raid. The photo was grainy, but she recognized him instantly. Ryder. Shackled. Expression calm. Eyes still fierce. The article painted him as a criminal, a menace to order. But she knew better. The man in that picture had restored her faith when the system crushed it. She folded the newspaper carefully, as if it carried something sacred, and placed it in a drawer beside the leather patch her son had found. Her heart ached. That night, she couldn't sleep. Memories rushed through her mind. The first time she met him, his promise, the note that brought her home. Every moment felt like a spark in the dark, guiding her to something bigger than fear. She knew she couldn't just sit and watch. Justice might have blindfolded itself, but she had learned to see. The next morning, she packed a small bag and told her son they were going on a trip. She didn't explain where or why, only that they had to thank someone. The road stretched endlessly ahead, dust rising behind their old car like smoke from the past. Every mile carried her closer to the courthouse, the same kind of place where her story had first broken, and where she would now return, not as a victim, but as a voice. When she arrived, the air felt heavy with judgment. Reporters swarmed, flashing cameras, shouting questions. She walked past them all, her head high, her steps steady. Inside, she saw Ryder being led in chains, his face unreadable. But when his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, respect, and gratitude that neither words nor walls could contain. Before the guards could stop her, she shouted, "He's not a criminal. He's the only man who gave me justice when the court denied it." The room fell silent. Cameras turned, and for a moment, the world saw not an outlaw, but a man who had done what others were too afraid to do. In that silence, a truth was born, one that even the law couldn't ignore. The courtroom froze. Reporters who had come for scandal suddenly found themselves witnessing something raw and real. Ryder stood taller, his eyes locked on hers, not with pride, but with a quiet acknowledgement. The judge banged his gavel, shouting for order, but it was too late. The woman's words had already broken through the walls of authority like thunder. Her courage became contagious. People began murmuring, then clapping, then standing. For the first time, the system had to listen to someone it had once silenced. The prosecutor tried to twist the story, calling her a manipulated woman blinded by sympathy. But she didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice trembling yet strong. "If being blinded by justice is a crime," she said, "then maybe you should all be behind bars too." Every word she spoke cracked the silence open a little more. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't powerful. But truth doesn't need titles to shake the earth. The judge stared at her, speechless. He recognized her, the same woman whose plea he had once ignored. His face turned pale as the memory resurfaced. Her tears, his indifference, the gavel's cold echo. Now, she was standing in front of him again, not begging but defying. It was as if destiny itself had dragged him into the light of his own hypocrisy. Ryder said nothing. He didn't have to. Every look, every scar, every silent moment spoke for him. When the guards tried to push him forward, he turned once more toward her and said, "Justice doesn't need permission." It was the last thing he said before being led away, but the words hung in the air like a vow. The mother felt her heart break, not from despair, but from the weight of what it meant to witness true courage. Outside, cameras swarmed her. They wanted drama, headlines, sensationalism. But what they captured instead was something timeless, a woman standing for the man who once stood for her. That image would travel farther than any verdict, reaching places where justice was still asleep and waking hearts that had long given up believing in it. The media storm exploded overnight. News outlets ran the story under every possible headline. Single mother defends biker leader in court. Hell's Angels savior or outlaw. Justice or rebellion. The world couldn't decide which side to believe, but one thing was clear. Her voice had cracked open a truth too loud to ignore. People began to question what justice really meant. Was it the letter of the law, or the spirit behind it? Messages poured in, letters from strangers, mothers who had lost faith in the system, fathers who had been silenced by money and power, ordinary people who saw a reflection of their own battles in hers. She read every single one of them, tears in her eyes, realizing that her pain had become a bridge, connecting hearts across miles and stories. Ryder's act of defiance had sparked something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Meanwhile, inside the prison walls, Ryder became a legend, not for his rebellion, but for his silence. He refused to name names or deny his choices. He accepted his sentence with the calm of a man who knew the truth didn't die just because someone locked a door. Other inmates whispered about him, some out of fear, others out of awe. "That's the man who stood up for a mother," they said. "That's the man who made the law listen." Outside, the mother visited every week. She brought books, letters, and sometimes drawings her son made. Motorcycles under sunsets, eagles in flight, the words "thank you," Ryder scrawled in crayon. Each visit became a ritual of gratitude and strength. She never cried in front of him. Instead, she smiled and told him the world was changing because of what he did, and he would simply nod, his eyes softening for the first time in years. But deep inside, she knew something the world didn't. Ryder hadn't just saved her life. He had restored the meaning of justice itself. And while the courts held him in chains, his legacy had already begun to ride free. Across every heart brave enough to believe that right and wrong don't need permission to exist. As the months passed, the story refused to fade. What had begun as a single act of defiance had become a movement. People began gathering on the courthouse steps where her voice had first echoed. They brought candles, photographs, leather jackets, and handwritten signs that read "Justice rides with us." It wasn't about bikers or rebellion anymore. It was about dignity, courage, and the belief that doing right should never depend on wealth or power. The single mother who had once been invisible was now a symbol of resilience. She didn't seek attention, but the world found her anyway. Journalists from across the country came to interview her, expecting anger or revenge. Instead, they found humility. "Ryder didn't teach me to fight the law," she said softly during one broadcast. "He taught me to remember why we fight at all, for those who can't." Her words struck deeper than any protest chant. They reminded people that true justice wasn't about punishment. It was about compassion, about standing up when silence becomes complicity. Meanwhile, behind bars, Ryder's health began to decline. Years of battles, injuries, and sleepless nights had taken their toll. But he never complained. When doctors asked him why he refused treatment, he just said, "Some debts can't be repaid with comfort." He spent his days reading letters from strangers, the walls of his cell covered in drawings, and thank you notes from people whose lives had been changed by his story. Even the guards treated him differently, not as a prisoner, but as a man who had stood for something bigger than himself. One winter morning, the mother received a call. Ryder was in critical condition. Her heart clenched, but she didn't hesitate. She drove through the night, headlights carving through fog and snow. When she arrived, they let her in without question. In the sterile quiet of the infirmary, she found him resting, frail, pale, but peaceful. He smiled weakly when he saw her, as though he'd been waiting all along. "You kept your promise," he whispered. "You made them listen." She took his hand and held it tightly. "You made me believe," she said, tears falling freely. In that moment, there were no walls, no chains, only two souls bound by something unbreakable. He closed his eyes, a faint smile still on his lips. "Justice rides free," he murmured one last time. And just like that, the man who had fought the law with loyalty and fire became part of something eternal, a legend whispered on every wind that carried the roar of a motorcycle. The news of Ryder's death spread like wildfire. Across towns and highways, bikers gathered, not in rage but in unity. Hundreds of engines roared to life in tribute, their sound echoing through valleys, cities, and deserts. They called it the Ride of Silence. No one spoke. No one needed to. It was their way of saying goodbye to the man who had given their brotherhood meaning again. At the front of the convoy rode a woman and her son, both wearing small patches stitched with the words "Ride for Ryder." When they reached the courthouse steps, the same place where everything had begun, the engines went silent. The mother stepped forward, holding a single rose and placing it on the cold stone. Her son placed a leather patch beside it. The crowd bowed their heads as she spoke, her voice calm but resonant. "The world called him an outlaw," she said, "but to us he was the law that never failed, the law of heart, loyalty, and truth." Her words drifted through the air like prayer, wrapping around everyone present. In the months that followed, a foundation was born, the Ryder Project. It offered legal aid to single parents, veterans, and those crushed by the same system that once failed her. Every case they won carried Ryder's emblem somewhere hidden, a silent tribute to the man who had made the impossible real. The movement grew, inspiring chapters around the world, not of rebellion, but of redemption. Years later, the little boy, now a man, stood where his mother once had, beneath a sky painted with sunset. He wore a leather jacket, aged and worn, with Ryder's insignia stitched over his heart. He smiled, remembering the stories, the sound of engines, and the man who changed everything. "Justice rides free," he whispered, just as a distant roar filled the air, faint but unmistakable. And in that sound, in every hum of a distant engine, lived a promise that would never die. Because some legends don't need wings to rise. They only need a road, a cause, and a heart brave enough to ride it. In the end, justice did not arrive with fanfare or headlines. It came quietly, through the choices of a few who dared to stand against silence. The story of the single mother and the outlaw biker became more than memory. It became a mirror, reflecting everything the world forgets about what it means to be human. She was never just a victim. and he was never just an outlaw. They were two souls who met at the edge of despair and built a bridge made of courage, loyalty, and belief. Their paths crossed in pain, but what they left behind was hope. Raw, imperfect, but real. As the years passed, people stopped speaking about the trial, the raid, the fire. But they never stopped whispering his name. Ryder. To some, he was still a criminal. To others, he was the proof that justice has a heartbeat. And sometimes, it beats loudest in those the world misunderstands. The mother carried his story like a lantern, lighting the way for others who felt unheard. And every time she saw a motorcycle disappear into the horizon, she smiled, knowing that somewhere, someone was still fighting for what was right. Justice, she learned, isn't about power. It's about presence. It's about showing up for the ones who have no voice. It's about doing what's right, even when the world insists it's wrong. The court may have judged her unworthy, but fate disagreed. Because in the end, it wasn't a robe or a gavel that restored balance. It was a man with scars, a woman with faith, and a road that never stopped leading toward redemption. So when you think about justice, think beyond the courtroom. Think of the hands that hold on when everything else lets go. Think of the hearts that rise when the world tries to bury them. The lesson this story leaves behind isn't about revenge. It's about the power of standing for what's right, even when no one else will. Because sometimes, the most powerful laws are the ones written in the soul. If this story touched you, share it. Let it remind others that kindness still has warriors and that justice still has riders. Leave your thoughts below. Tell us what justice means to you. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, make sure you're part of this journey. Subscribe, like, and stay with us. Because the next story might just remind you that even in the darkest roads, there's always someone riding toward the light.